Well, thanks very much for those stimulating remarks, Dr. Mastio, Ms. Hun. We don't have much time, so I'll just very briefly introduce our second two panelists, and we'll dive right into discussion on energy. Professor Henry Lee directs the Environmental and Natural Resources Program at Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He has extensive experience in governor as the director of the Massachusetts State Energy Office. He's worked with many companies and institutions, among them General Electric, the Inter-American Development Bank, US EPA. He's delivered testimony before both chambers of the United States Congress, Department of Energy, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Welcome. Dr. Daniel Klingenfeld is the head of the Director's Office at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, which is, as you probably know, the preeminent German institution producing modeling and analysis related to climate change and sustainable development. Cambridge is familiar to Dr. Klingenfeld as he completed a master's here at the Kennedy School in 2008 and previously worked at IHS Cambridge Energy Research Associates. He's published extensively on strategies for addressing climate change, and I hope today we'll be able to have a fruitful discussion about the nexus between climate change, energy, and security. I'll start with you, Dr. Klingenfeld. We're fast approaching what you've characterized as a 2 °C guardrail, which is basically a tipping point beyond which the effects of global temperature rise will be catastrophic and irreversible, are likely to be so. Germany's obviously leading in trying to directly address this problem with the Energiewende, but one country's efforts, maybe one continent's efforts won't be enough. I'd like you to comment on what you think, what will it take to achieve that degree of climate protection?
Yeah, sure. Thanks first. It's great to be back. So thank you also to the organizers for the invitation here to Harvard. So first of all, maybe to say on that 2 °C guardrail, as you called it, this is a very complex, question, and it, may take too much time to talk about it. But in the essence, it is a political target as well. So it's taken in a way out of a risk management perspective, and has made its way first from German and European policy circles up to the international level, and was mentioned first officially in a way in the Copenhagen climate negotiation document. So in a way, I would not characterize it as a threshold between an area of bliss and then catastrophe. It's always gradual processes in climate change, but certainly there's good evidence that the risk humanity would be facing well beyond that threshold would be increasing disproportionately. So just to position that. But you're right, it's important when we talk about national initiatives like the German Energiewende or the US move to increase its natural gas supplies, we should be always contextualize this in the international context. And the sad reality here is that global emissions keep on increasing year on year. The latest figures for the year 2013 put global CO2 emissions at about 36 billion metric tons for that year. That's a new record, and there's no evidence that this increasing trend is going to be broken anytime soon. Actually, it's an increase over the year 1990 of over 60% now. So the world is clearly carbonizing. We're very far away from the so-called global emissions peak. And now coming back to that 2 °C threshold, to make a very complex phenomenon easy, you could say that the global emissions peak would have to occur sometime at the latest or before the year 2020. So this is in a way the task for policymakers to devise a global agreement that is more or less up to the task of managing the global emissions peak and then contributing to absolute declines ever after, and we're very far from there. So this just maybe as a first comment on where we stand, despite those initiatives that are being taken nationally and of course regionally and locally.
Thanks. I'd like to go to you, Ms. Hun. We're talking about addressing these issues on a national scale in Germany, and we heard a lot about the costs of the Energiewende and industrial competitiveness. I'd like to press you a little bit on the feasibility of taking forward such an aggressive policy on more or less a unilateral level within Europe. Can this work? Who's going to pay for this? Dr. Mastio alluded to what he sees as a success, a necessary success in the future. How's that going to happen?
Yes, you think maybe we can compare, for example, the cost for a new nuclear power plant that is planned in Great Britain and our new photovoltaic plants and windmills, So, for example, in Great Britain, the government said to the investors, we would like to have a new nuclear power plant. And the investors said, yes, so you must guarantee a price for this nuclear power plant. And so the British government decided to make something like the Renewable Energy Source Act for nuclear power plants. And that means they will give for 35 years, not 20 as we do in Germany, for 35 years, for this nuclear power plants, a price of 14 euro cent per kilowatt hour. And with and they would like to add the inflation rate on that too, So that means 35 years, 14 euro cent with inflation rate. So we have for new renewable energies in Germany, for this photovoltaic plants, a price of 12.5 euro cent, and they are decreasing every month, only for 20 years, and we have for windmills about 7 to 9 euro cent. So that means now our new renewables are only half of the cost of that nuclear power plant in Great Britain. Yes, we have this rucksack of the cost of the renewables of the last years. That's right. But you have a lot of costs, for example, for nuclear waste. Who will pay for that? Who will pay for the disasters of something like Fukushima, Who will pay, for example, for climate problems? For example, all the number of floods we will have. So we had in the last years, every 3 years, a 100 years flood in eastern part of Germany. And that means 8 billion for every flood, So I think, yes, we have to talk about the costs, but we have to talk about the cost of fossil fuels, we have to talk about the cost of nuclear power, and not only about the cost of renewables.
I would agree with you there. I'm not sure if Dr. Mastio would entirely agree with some of the things you said in your remarks, but I'd like to hit on a point related to that, which is the cost and really who pays. I'd like to talk about infrastructure. Renewable energy might be cost competitive or better than fossil fuel and nuclear in certain cases. But what about the system costs and the upgrades that are going to be necessary in Germany and really worldwide if we're really going to have a state-of-the-art system? Could you address that, Dr. Mastio?
Good way to behave on the panel is ignoring the question and answering something else. No, I won't. The point. First of all, I think that cost thing, you can do all this modeling, and the numbers you quoted, absolutely correct. And I'm not sure whether we ever get this as a good, solid basis for a 50 years ahead infrastructure plan. All things can happen, where any couple of billions numbers, latest since 2008, I have lost it. When somebody says it's cost you 12 billion or somebody says 112, for me, I can't relate. Sorry. In that sense, the real interesting question is, how can you go through the phase? There can't be any disagreement that the learning curve of those environmentally friendly technologies are very steep in a positive sense. They have to grow significantly. But I'm coming into this like with a practitioner's guide on how to implement a renewable scheme type thing. And there's a few learnings along that way that we cannot ignore. One, that whole change is a matter of the right synchronicity. So you can agree as a society to phase out of nuclear, you can agree to duck out of coal, fine. Over a period of time, you have to live with both. And you have to live with both the cost. And renewables do not one-for-one replace a shut-down nuclear plant. Let's get this clear. Because let's make a simple test. You guys have your graduation party planned for a Saturday, pick one, next year, and you ask two guys. One with a company says, I'm going to deliver that energy on that day for that cost, and it will come. And there's, say, a renewable source for a lesser price, and let's say it's solar. Raise your hand who puts your bet on your graduation party on that solar guy today. Right, thanks. So my point is there will be the time, and I'm absolutely aligned with you, where storage in combination with that right mix will support going through that entire renewable at some point. We cannot disagree. But I think the political debate has to acknowledge the transition phase in a proper way. So the phasing, the allocation of step 1, step 2, step 3. And for me, that's the key learning that we can offer from our country. You can have the right intent, you put a good incentive in play, but to understand the collateral implications around you is very, very difficult. And you have to take into account infrastructure, existing plant, jobs, international competitiveness, and the climate. And that's, I think, where now, which is, I'm very positive on this, we can give a little bit of a blueprint to others, say, look at these learnings and do something clever with it. So I have evaded successfully your question on cost, but I try to make the point, I'm not fussed about that costing only. That's the wrong one dimension. But you have to put these things in parallel and make some clever judgment, go one step another and another. Don't spill out the baby with the bathwater. That will definitely go wrong.
Well, I'm not sure you could characterize American energy policy as clever, but I'd like to ask Professor Lee about that. The theme of the conference is, are the US and Germany drifting apart? So it would seem on the issue of energy and certainly climate. And it was mentioned earlier in the conference that the US appears to be sort of poised to enhance its dominance geostrategically with a greater degree of energy independence and cheap energy. So how do you see US energy policy playing out in the next few years? Do you agree with that statement, and what does that mean to you?
Do I agree with the statement that we're going to become energy independent?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you have to look at this in the perspective. Certainly the events of the last 5 years have been very impressive, particularly in the area of oil, where in the last year we increased our oil production by 1.4 million barrels, which is the second largest increase in the history of the world in 1 year in the oil industry. We have increased our production of natural gas by about 15 to 20%. By the way, most all of that gas has gone to the utility sector. We have replaced, we've gone from 52% dependence on coal to 39% dependence on coal. So there have been a lot of significant changes. And we've also now looking to become an exporter of fossil fuels, which is not going to help the climate problem when we're exporting our coal and exporting our surplus oil and exporting our surplus natural gas. But certainly there's a lot of momentum out there moving in that direction. But a lot of this depends on what the price of oil is. What you have to understand is the price of oil has been around $100 now for almost 3 years, which is approximately $30 over what I would consider the marginal cost of producing. So the oil industry is making a lot of money. Can that price hold? Well, certainly international instability has done a lot to keep that price up there. And we can continue to have instability, and we can continue to, even it could get worse. But starting in 2015, all the production that was invested when that price started to rise in the mid part of the last decade is all going to start coming online, 2015, 2016, 2017. It's not at all clear that oil prices are going to stay at $100. We had a panel last year here in which we had two panelists say that price would go down between 30 and 50. I'm not going to claim that's going to happen. But the one thing I've known from 35 years of watching the oil industry is it doesn't stay in any place for very long. And if you go down on oil price, it's going to dry up a lot of the shale development, simply because, for shale oil, simply because of the fact that you have to make, it's very well intensive, you have to have multiple wells, and the amount of money you have to keep reinvesting every year. You can dry that investment up in 6 months. And as for natural gas, well, it was $3.50. The price now is $5.50 in many parts of the country. It's probably going to average for the year around $4.70. And that price is going to continue to rise. And as it rises, all of a sudden, the idea that we can have 40 trillion cubic feet of gas and be powering our cars and be changing our whole fabric of our society is going to, I think, alter. I think a lot of it's going to go, continue to go into utilities. I think we're going to continue to pull back on our use of coal, and that's going to allow us to meet President Obama's climate goal. But we have a lot to do more if we're going to meet the global climate goal, the one set in several of the framework conventions. But if we're going to do 50%, 80%, we're moving in the wrong direction in the United States at the moment.
If I could have you just follow up very quickly, if you were designing the policy, what would it look like?
Well, that's the hard part. I can describe the problem. I'm not too good at designing
help you.
policy. What do I think we ought to do? Well, I mean, the simple way is we ought to put a price on carbon, which we're not likely to do in the next few years. If you look at what's going to happen in climate, it's the gas to coal substitution. It's also the CAFE standards, which it's going to take a long time to implement. And remember, it's being revisited by Congress in 2017. So we're not completely going to meet the Obama goal. Congress could reverse direction when after President Obama is gone. But I think you have to have a price on carbon. And I'll say something somewhat controversial. I think it has to move gradually up to around $150 a ton to $200 a ton if we're actually going to meet the 50% or 80% goal. So this notion of $17, which we can't even absorb in the United States now, is going to have to be much, much higher if this world is going to change. And I think without that, it's going to be really difficult to change the United States through executive order, which is the present course we're on. The second thing we have to do is put a lot more money into R&D and a lot more effort into R&D. Energy storage would be a game changer if you could do this. It would open up enormous opportunities for system improvements that would provide incentives for renewable energy. So I think that's the most important single thing if we could change energy storage. And there's a lot of people working on it. We're still not there at the moment.
Can I maybe just follow up on that? So I think what you said, Henry, is absolutely correct, that the current US emissions reductions aren't really driven by a forceful climate policy, but they are like an indirect beneficial result, at least nationally, out of a competitive situation where gas is just accessible with those new technologies. And it really points to the question that we have to think in an integrated way. I mean, what's the global effect of that expansion in the first place of the fossil fuel resource space? But because that's what it is. And I would actually put forward that the emissions reductions in the US we're seeing now with the shale revolution have not had a net beneficial effect on global emissions, because we've heard, you've mentioned that, world coal prices have decreased. It's a world economy, and we know this, but we have to re-emphasize, look at the data. And now that coal that is not being used in US power plants is still being mined, and it's being shipped off to countries like India that are really expanding their coal-based power generation at a very fast pace. So really, for global climate policy, I can only re-emphasize we're not on track. And I would second Professor Lee by saying that ultimately pricing carbon, and not just in some isolated pockets, and the EU it's a big pocket, but it's still a pocket. But going broader in that sense is a crucial thing to do. But for that, and probably won't have the time to debate that today, but I wanted to mention it, ultimately we have to talk about the question of how a limited global carbon budget, because you can translate this in, you can quantify it for any climate target. Of course, you can be a bit more risky than 2 degrees, but for any climate target, you can quantify this in a limited carbon budget. This needs to be allocated, needs to be shared somehow. Of course, technology assistance will be part of the package, but you need to think about a global deal. And you need to think about global fairness. We will not resolve that now, but I wanted to make that point. It can't just be by focusing on short-term economic policy. It needs to involve political leadership to really address that issue, and not just by accident, more or less, make emissions reductions. And by the way, that would also, in my view, go for the German perspective, where we focus very much on national targets, but I don't think that we really have a credible proposal in terms of the negotiations for how they could really work globally.
Do you think that, Ms. Hun, do you think that it's possible for Germany to take a stronger role within Europe leading on energy policy? It doesn't seem like the Commission is going in the same direction that Germany would like it to. And it seems like there's a very interesting tension between something that's been mentioned several times, which is between industrial competitiveness and new energy system. So how can Germany lead?
Mm-hmm. We have now the old Commission, so we will have this year in May the election, the European election, and after that the new Commission. So we don't know what's about the new commissioners, but you see, it would be better to have a European energy vendor. Because, for example, we are talking about the time when we have no wind or no sun, but we have a European energy policy. We had, for example, the wind coming from the west, so first from Great Britain and Netherlands, and after that from Germany, and then from Poland, and then the next wind is coming from Great Britain. So if you have whole Europe, you have less time where you have no wind, So, and you can combine, for example, the very sunny regions of South Europe with others. So it would be better to have the European energy policy. But we have the situation that, for example, Poland is very involved in coal. Poland is very interested in fracking. We have the situation in Great Britain. So Great Britain would like to be more engaged in nuclear power. So I'm very interested in the debate of nuclear power in Great Britain because it's really expensive because of other alternatives. We have the discussion in France. So France is a bit more thinking to renewables, but nowadays, 70% of the energy mix is from nuclear power. But for example, I was 10 years Minister of Environment and Agriculture. And so the farmers, they are inviting me from France because they say, oh, what's with our colleagues in Germany? Because the colleagues in Germany, they have 20% of the wellness, of the welfare, of the economic profit from renewables are going to the farmers, So the farmers, they have the windmills, or if they don't have the windmills, they get a rent of the field, The farmers, they have big roofs, so they have the stables and can have the photovoltaic on the stable roofs. And the farmers have an alternative income, not only for the food, but also they are energy producers. And so I think there is a pressure from, for example, the farmers, from the rural areas. They would like to be involved in such an energy vendor we have in Germany. So I'm optimistic that we can have a perspective for whole Europe, and that would be the best case.
Thank you. There still seems to be, to me, some lingering questions. If you have a distributed generation and people that are off the grid increasingly, that seems like it puts additional stresses on a system. Yet we still want to see At the same time, we want to see a more integrated system where it can be flexible in incorporating PV capacity in the south, wind capacity in the north, et cetera. So, Dr. Mastio, what does that mean? If this is really the future, what does it mean for the future of the utility business model? What does a utility do in the future?
Real-time question, actually, for us. First of all, what don't we do anymore? Maybe the first starting point. We say goodbye to that steady income from centralized power generation, full stop, because it is not giving what we need for reinvest. Then the strategic answer is actually very simple. When you look at the rest of the value chain, that is infrastructure, renewables, and I call it customer solution close to the customer, all that smart grid stuff and the electro mobility thing connected with smart measurements of your other demand in a house and all that stuff are growing profit pools, and there are technology leaps ahead. So the first answer is you have to shift the investment and your management focus from that centralized business to the rest. That's the first straightforward answer. Second, with the fact that every day the number of participants in electricity market in general increases. Just to put this into perspective, we have 450 power plants in Germany, and we have 1.3 million decentralized power producing assets of renewable nature, tendency rising. With that complexity, the value of managing system integrity and intelligently linking data and, say, making the electricity management for those people is a new profit pool for us. And here is where the empire strikes back. We have done this for 100 years, and we do this reasonably well. So we will not stop managing the entire value chain, but we're going to extract that knowledge and package it differently. Because if somebody like a photovoltaic owner is not getting a subsidy anymore and someday has to market his electricity, he will appreciate an understanding of how do I do this, as much as somebody who is a stock owner might go to somebody helping him with that. So the future of the business is certainly these three things: infrastructure, decentralized energy, and smart solutions. And the future for our company, Assumption, is capitalizing on that systems know-how in a world that is definitely going to be more complex. And little side remarks, that's about business opportunity. So the phase out of nuclear in our system means we're going to greenfield the plant. You can either capture it, you put a big concrete block on top of it, Model 1, Model 2, you just greenfield it, you rebuild it. The cost of doing that is about 5 million euros. That's about 8 million euros per month per block for 20 years. And we're going to do this right now for 2 of our plant. And if I can save 10% of that, the guys who can be quick with their calculators see that this is a big 3 million digit dollar number. So if we learn to do that professionally, I can spot on the map all those other plants that are going to be taking off business, and I can market that know-how as a consulting business. So you learn from that change in the market by completely new business models, and you just don't do your money anymore by centralized power business. I think that's the solution.
Sounds like your American utility friend should be paying attention to you. Yeah.
I just
Would you like-
add
please.
2 things. One, if you have one energy source or system that you subsidize, and another one you don't subsidize, the one you subsidize is going to get quite popular over time, and the one you don't subsidize is going to find itself in a less competitive advantage or at a disadvantage. So it's not surprising that a lot of people are going to these distributive technologies. Second, one of the problems with this subsidy is it tends to be somewhat regressive. So if you happen to, right now, if you put a solar collector on your house, it's your neighbors who are helping pay part of the cost of that system. And the third point I would point out is that this whole electric system in the United States was all distributed technology when it started. And we moved towards a centralized system because for system economics, it became cheaper. And if you look at where the renewable technologies are going, where's wind going? Wind is going to bigger and bigger windmills. I mean, we're talking 6 megawatt windmills. I mean, these things have blades that are the length of this room. We are going to photovoltaic arrays, which are the really cheapest areas of photovoltaic. You would need one large inverter. You don't have to have every inverter for every house. It's also easier on the system. So it's, I could see a situation, I think it's actually very likely that photovoltaic arrays are going to be around 8 to 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour in the United States within about 2 to 3 years. I cannot believe that it is going to be cheaper to put a photovoltaic array on my house than to buy it off a central system. So if you want to subsidize, distributive technologies, people will go to it. That doesn't mean if you had a fair market that distributive technologies would prove to be as advantageous to centralized system, even depending on renewables.
I think Ms. Hun wanted to get in.
Yes, I agree with in some points, but in other not. So, for example, that there's every time central systems are less expensive than decentralized systems. That's not the truth. So that's right that the windmills are growing. So we have now 6 megawatt, and the next generation will follow, and they are higher, and they are running for more hours per year. So the new ones, the modern ones, they have about the same hours they are running per year, like, for example, some hot coal plants. So they're really good, and they're coming to more and more 100% energy security. But on the other hand, for example, we have this decentralized systems, for example, this photovoltaic plants. And the photovoltaic plants, I said in Germany, they have now a subsidy of about 12-13 euro cent per kilowatt hour. But a normal consumer has to pay 28 euro cent per kilowatt hour. So really, it's a good situation to make it on the roof, not only for house owners, but also for big house owners, for a lot of people who have their apartments there, who rent their apartments there, and have less electricity prices because of this photovoltaic plant there on the roof. And you don't need, for example, the grid costs. So if you have centralized systems, you need a lot of grids to bring this electricity to the last farmer's household. If you have photovoltaic plants, windmills, and they are more and more independent of the grid, you don't need this grid cost, for example. So there are different solutions, and the solutions are more and more that the decentralized systems in the whole are less expensive than, for example, hard coal plants. So we have now the situation, if you make your investment, and we'll start now with windmills or hard coal plants, the windmills are less expensive than the hard coal plants, So we have this reduction of costs for renewables, and that means, as I said, 80% in 10 years. For example, for photovoltaic plants, and that means the decentralized systems are less and less expensive. In some years, they are not only cheaper than hard coal plants, but they are also cheaper than, for example, lignite plants. That's only a question of years.
Well, can I just one rebuttal? I'll be very quick.
Yes, we'll have one.
I agree
very
with you
brief
that
round.
they may very well be cheaper than lignite plants or nuclear plants. But you have to understand that if you want to depend on a photovoltaic, and it's not sunny that day, you either have to be hooked up to the system, which means you're paying for the distribution system. You may not be able to pay for transmission, but you at least have to pay for the distribution, or you have to install a storage system in order to deal with these gaps.
Yes. Yes.
That would have been my comment as well, because you said you don't need that cost, correct, but be specific. For those guys who have that panel, that same guy and having his graduation party in his house and wants to have his party in the evening will have to be connected to the grid, and somebody got to pay for it. And if that person ducks out, somebody else has to pay. Simple as that. So watch this cost comparison. I would agree with you. The cost for the technology and all this stuff, you can compare apples to apples. But it is important to understand what is the infrastructure you need as long you don't have storage.
Yeah, only one sentence. But you can combine it because you have not only the photovoltaic plants, but you have this very small heat and power generators. And if you combine all this together, it's now less expensive than, for example, this centralized plants. And that is coming more and more into reality because the storage price will decrease in the next years a lot, you see, and that means these decentralized systems with heat and power generators, with photovoltaic plants, and with these storages, they will beat the centralized systems.
That sounds like a very interesting all of the above approach. We have only about 10 minutes left, so I'd like to go to the audience now for questions. Oh, lots of questions. Just here in front, please. Gentleman here.
Thanks a lot. So during the two keynote speeches, I think I was impressed, or there was one interesting point. Both mentioned the overproduction of renewables. Mr. Söhn used it to actually illustrate how powerful renewable energies are, and Dr. Mastieux used it to actually show the amazing mismatch sometimes between production and demand. And we had now in the panel discussion the point of storage, which is strongly connected to that a lot. But so the point of storage is mentioned a lot, but not very specifically. So my question would be, and I mean, Germany is facing this problem right now. What are the methods that are, the most likely to solve this problem? Are those developed already? And what are the political implications, actually? I mean, so one simple way of doing it, you have a hydro pumping storage, for example, but who would build it in Germany? I mean, it's not possible. I mean, it's politically highly explosive. So what are alternatives to that are actually also politically executable?
Conscious of time, two quick answers. Number one, storage needs to be developed, and that will go its course. Second answer is, what you can do is adjust your support system. For example, today, everybody who runs a wind farm gets, at any point in time, his subsidy. If you make that dependent on the electricity price per se, so when you have a lot of electricity, your price goes down and actually gets negative, a couple of €1,000 per kilowatt, by the way. If you cap it at zero, that's when a lot of wind coming in and you say you have too much, the market price goes down to zero and you stop for that moment in time the subsidy. The guy with that wind farm, and you give him a total budget, not say his megawatts, but a budget over kilowatt hours, he will think twice whether he takes the money at a negative price or whether we'll take it as a high market price. That's the way to deal with the excess power in a non-technical sense, apart from the storage options that you have.
We both talked about the overcapacities, but what are the overcapacities? Are the renewables or the new hardcore power plants? So we reduced the capacities of the nuclear power plants we had in our energy mix 35%, and now we have about 17, 18 or something like that, So we reduced it about 17%. So, and the renewables started till now 25%. So the less of nuclear power capacities, it's now from renewables. And beside that, we have this 10 new hardcore plants and lignite plants. And so what's the overcapacity? The renewables or the hardcore plants, you know? So I would say that's the hardcore plants. Even, for example, we have very old lignite plants, you know? They are 40 or 50 years old. And they have an efficiency of about 30% or 25% or something like that. And I would like to phase them out because they are really climate killers. And if we have these new ones, we can shut them down, these old ones. And that's a part of the policy. And as I said, we have to think for the energy vendor, but we have to think for climate protection too, because there are two goals, you know. And on the other side, we are just discussing, and a lot of points, we are on the same side. So that's very maybe surprising. But for example, we are now discussing in Germany what's about the next steps of the energy vendor. And it's not easy. It's not easy. Even to me, it's not easy, you know. And I will tell you the truth, you know. But as I said, for example, windmills, they are very cheap. So we have the situation in Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria, and we have this nuclear power plants in Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria, and we would like to phase them out in the next years. And so that's the best idea to say we have windmills. They have only the cost of 9 eurocent per kilowatt hour in south countries, and so do it, you know. But we see, for example, from our Minister of Energy, he would like to limit this windmills because the windmills are the one side, but the hardcore plants are the others. The hardcore plants, who are the owners, the big companies, and the big companies, they have stress. But the Minister of Energy, he is very, very close linked to these companies, you know, for example, to RWE. This minister is very close to the trade unions, for example.
In the interest of time, could we just collect a couple of questions?
But, so I say that's a political fight.
One
you know,
question.
that's not a technical fight, but it's the political fight.
The woman in red here, please.
Thank you. I'm a mechanical engineer and I worked in power generation. My name is Sofia Morio. I work for the Pilgrim Power Station. I'm not in favor of nuclear or coal or whatever, but when you want industrial development, are you going to sustain them with hot air? You need to maintain the plants the way the doctor told us that if you want to have the party at night, you need a lot of energy. How are you going to sustain the industrial development? Just blowing, and today is wind and tomorrow it isn't? I mean, we need to be realistic and have our feet on the ground and understand what makes this world moving forward. It's easy to blame and to point the finger, but we need to understand what the basis of all that is and find a logical solution and to resolute both sides. It's not as easy. Yes, when you live on a village, a little windmill would help. But when you live on a big city, and you need to provide electricity and power for schools, for hospitals, for industry and development, it's not enough.
2 sentences from each of you, please.
Start.
Only a short comment. I am living in industrial region, in the Ruhr region, and that's the fossil region of Germany, you know? That's a fossil region, the coal region. And just as you argued, they are arguing in my region, you know, but they are losing their competence. They are losing their competence for energy because they said, oh, we have these big power stations, and there are only these small photovoltaic plants, the small windmills. They never will be a solution for our problems. And now they are a solution for 25% of the electricity. Now, to my house, to the house in the cities, 25% of the electricity is coming from this very small photovoltaic plants or windmills, you know? And that is a disaster for my region, because they said, oh, that will never happen. And it happened, you know? So the decentralized systems, they were very successful, and now our companies has a problem. Our companies are losing jobs because they were not quick enough, they were not flexible enough to have a solution for this increasing renewables.
That's a fantastic illustration. Dr. Klingenfeld.
Yes, so I mean, your point has to be taken seriously. There's not only risks from climate change, but also risks from decarbonization. So we have to face that. I mean, there will be more lessons to be learned, more costs to be borne. But I would say, you know, trying to kind of see both perspectives, the risks arising from climate change are really severe to the point where we cannot manage them. I'd like to, maybe this finishing with, point you to a very recent report that the World Bank put out and our institute contributed, looking at a 4 degrees centigrade warmer world. It's called Turn Down the Heat. You find it online. And it kind of gives you a glimpse at what's in store if we kind of not act because we are afraid of this new world, of this transformation that lies ahead of us. So I think it's always balancing the different risks. And my conclusion would be we have to embark on this journey, which will have positive surprises, but of course, which is not without risk, but we have to take that learning lesson. I don't see any credible alternative.
If these are summary remarks, I guess I would make 2 points. One is there is a strong probability that we will be confronting in the next 5 years a period of lower fossil fuel prices at a time in which we're trying to phase out of fossil fuels and we're trying to go to renewable systems, and it will be harder for renewable systems to compete against low gas prices and low oil prices and in some parts of the world, low coal prices. Now, I'm not saying it's 100%, but I think that I think we should prepare for that going forward. The second thing is, when you're looking at renewables, I think that one of my answers to you is that you could put up 6 of today's windmills and you could basically provide enough electricity for all of Harvard. The problem is that we wouldn't provide that electricity when it wasn't windy. So you have to think of systems. You can't think of wind, solar. You have to think of electricity systems that can incorporate intermittent power. And the answer to the question, one of the answers, by the way, that is that you've got to build an effective modern transmission system. So if it's windy in one part of the country and not windy in the other, you can move power around. Again, a lot of places, they don't build the transmission system because they can't figure out who's going to pay for it. So Germany needs about 5,000 miles of additional transmission, because a lot of their wind power is going to be in the northern part of the country. A lot of their industry is in the central and the southern part of the country. So you have to think from a systems point of view, and the idea of, you know, is it going to be windy when we have our party at 7 o'clock, or if it's going to be sunny that day, is a big problem if you're overly dependent on renewables. You're going to need backup power, and you're going to have to really pray that storage systems get dramatically improved and come online in the next decade.
And maybe because we have so many young people, slow and basically do not stop.
But it's incredibly expensive.
Right. I think there is no doubt that the change to that decentralized renewables world will come, because technology will allow sooner or later. In the meantime, as little as ideology as possible is the key thing. Pragmatism purely. That's my second sentence.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panel.